In this episode of Kerbal Gets Real Redux, we are going to be seeing Shackleton IV arriving at Mars and discovering why good planning may be pivotal to the success of a mission in RP1. We're also going to be further exploring the lunar surface by attempting to land on the far side of the moon for the first time, a feat that is made somewhat more difficult with Principia. This will allow us to complete the lunar surface exploration program, which in turn will open us up to the ability to set up a geostationary communications network. Now, I do profusely apologise if I sound a little bit disheartened, maybe disheartened is the wrong word, a little bit ill over the course of this episode. Unfortunately, I have woken up this morning with an incredibly sore throat, and I'm going to try and push through and record the voiceover for this episode because I want to get this all done. And this voiceover is actually being recorded a couple of weeks in the past. I'm trying to get as much of these episodes done in one go so I can schedule them for release, and then that way I can actually work on some other videos that I've had ideas for a really long time that I've just not really had the time to put any energy or focus in. And I figured if I get a lot of Kerbal Gets Real Redux done all at once, then that opens up a lot of time for me to maybe work on some special one-off videos that are going to be maybe a little bit more exciting, maybe delve into some more KSP2 stuff as well, because I know I've had people ask me they want some KSP2 content. And yeah, that's basically what I'm going to be planning on doing. Anyway, yes, enough about what all that is about, my personal life and being sick. We are now viewing LPO2, which is the second lunar polar orbiter. If you saw the end of the last episode, you would know that unfortunately, the first time I attempted to fly one of these, it didn't go very well, and the launch vehicle actually failed. The X405H on the Odyssey did not get us up to orbit, which meant that I had to use the TLI stage to get us into orbit, and I could not get the lunar polar orbiter to the moon. So it was a bit of a misnomer, really. It never went to the moon, it just stayed in Earth orbit. This time round though, it goes a lot better, and we are able to fire up the 3 baby sergeants on the back of this to get us into a rough lunar orbit. But it's not quite the nice low circular orbit that I need this to be in that is going to successfully map the entire surface of the moon for us. So I do have a pair of generic RCS thrusters on this small cube satellite as well, which puts us into its final orbit, which is a very nice low orbit around the moon. Perfect for completing the visible imaging experiment as well as the ScanSat that is on board this satellite. So a success to begin with, that's always nice to happen, and I swear that this episode is not going to be full of failures. Now that we've got that in its orbit though, we are going to have to wait quite a while for that to actually perform its task. It does need to map the entire moon, and obviously the moon has a very slow rotation. 1 day on the moon is 28 days, but I do have a ScanSat on this vessel, which means, as you could see just then, we get some very lovely views of the moon. Right now we are back at Shackleton IV, which is my Mars mission that I launched in the last episode. And this is going to be a Mars orbiter and a lander. We need to do a bit of a deep space maneuver though right now in order to try and get my flyby of Mars as close as possible, but that is very quickly done. And I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that Principia may make it somewhat harder for me to get a far side lunar landing. And that is because probes that stay around the moon with Principia installed tend to not last very long unless you put them in a frozen orbit. So I actually had to go back to the lunar polar orbiter and do a little bit of station keeping to prevent it from crashing into the moon. And I'm going to have to do that constantly. There are a few frozen orbits around the moon that you can put your satellites in, but they're quite difficult to achieve. And I have found even when going for those inclinations, sometimes they don't always work. And the closest that you can get to polar is 86 degrees, which should roughly cover the entire moon, but maybe not quite fully. Over the course of this Space Center section, I did pick up mature capsules, which does unlock the Apollo command module. Probably not going to be using that for a while yet though, because it is heavier than Gemini, and I'm fairly sure I could do Lunar Gemini instead. We have also built up Spark 13 as well as LFSCD, which we are now going to launch. As these launches were a day apart, I decided rather than showcasing them one after the other, I would do both at once. So on the 23rd and the 24th of May 1963, we launch LFSCD, I think that's the right acronym, as well as Spark 13. So the one that has lots of letters is going to be the Lunar Far Side Communications Device, and basically the first letters of that is what gave it that name. We need to send that at the same time as Spark 13, because we need to be able to communicate with Spark 13 once it lands on the far side of the moon. I do have the Lunar Polar Orbiter up in lunar orbit at the moment, but it is in a very low orbit, and that means that we're not really going to be able to talk to much of the far side of the moon at all. So what I am going to do with the Lunar Far Side Communications Device is put it in a much higher orbit than the LPO even is, and you can see me plotting out my maneuver there already and starting the burn to go to it. Now, because we've got two missions going pretty much at the same time, I've not shown every planning aspect of this mission. We will see the planning of this mission, the LFSCD, and it's basically the same as the LPO, just without one of the television cameras on the top, I think, which was required for that mission. It's nigh on identical, and because of that reason there is actually a problem with it once we arrive at the moon, which I will delve into once we get there. You can see we have now completed our burn with Spark 13 as well, and Spark 13 unfortunately had to be launched on top of a Pinnacle rocket rather than the Odyssey, which have been launching all of my previous lunar landers. And that's because to get an orbit around the moon and then land on the far side is going to take a much larger vehicle going to the moon than getting just a direct impact course and trying to slow down, doing a direct descent. Anyway, we are at the moon with the LFSCD, and as I mentioned, because I didn't change the probe, the center of mass was off when I fired up those baby sergeants, because the Lunar Polar Orbiter does have a slightly wonky center of mass, and that is how that solid rocket engine was configured to fire through, and I forgot to change that, which did put us on a bit of a weird trajectory, but luckily there was enough fuel in the generic RCS thrusters to correct the orbit and get us into an orbit that will actually be useful for Spark 13. How poor planning almost cost us Mars is the name of this episode, and it really should have been something more like how poor planning nearly cost us every single mission over the course of this episode, because that was dumb. That was really dumb on me, and that could have gone a lot better. If I would have simulated this mission and tried it out, I would have noticed that unfortunately the baby sergeants weren't firing through correctly, and I was using RCS build aid, but obviously I just had a bit of a dumb moment, a smooth brain moment, and decided not to shift around the center of mass. But Spark 13 has made it to the moon. We still have connection because of the Lunar Far Side Communication Device, and right now we are burning up the Juno 4K engine on the back of this. It has 3 ignitions to begin our descent to the surface of the moon. Having 3 ignitions for a lander is really useful. So the first ignition goes on actually getting into an orbit around the moon, and then that way I can pick my landing site with precision. The second burn is then used to lower our orbit so that we are on an impact course with the moon, and then finally the burn, which I am now doing, is used to slow us down so that the final stage can hopefully successfully land on the surface, on the far side of the moon. This poor probe is never going to see Earth again. But now as we make our final approach, we are going to be using 3 generic thrusters to bring us down to the surface. And that's because they have unlimited ignitions and they're also pretty weak. And I don't really want a super strong engine for this because then I would send it flying off. But using those 3 thrusters, we are able to softly touch down on the surface of the far side of the moon. And I still have a connection thanks to the Lunar Far Side Communication Device, and that means the far side landing contract is completed. With the science gain from that far side lunar lander, I come into research and development and pick up prototype spaceplanes. We're still some ways off of seeing spaceplanes in this series, but it's certainly nice to pick up the technology. I finished the Lunar Polar Orbiter contract as well. I had to return to the satellite very briefly in order for that to tick over, but that has now been done, and that means I have fully completed the objectives for the Lunar Surface Exploration Program. But now what's happened is the astronaut complex has been upgraded to level 4, and that means I can get George Edwards and Thierry Petit trained in the use of Gemini. I am proficiency training them right now, which unfortunately is going to take over 300 days, and that means we're not going to be seeing any Gemini flights over the course of this episode, because we're already in August. So on the 24th, we're going to be launching Lunar Polar Orbiter number 3, and I have not finished the Lunar Surface Exploration Program quite yet. because I want to farm a few contracts to try and get a little bit more confidence and reputation. I want to pick up some contracts at breakneck speed if I can, and currently I don't really have the confidence to do that. No one trusts in my space agency, the Earth Aeronautics and Space Administration, which I forgot a few episodes ago and I had to go look it up. But we are able to get to the moon with Lunar Polar Orbiter number 3, absolutely fine. And basically, in order for this to complete, I don't even really need to map any more of the moon. The first one mapped the entire thing. I just needed to launch a new vessel. So this really wasn't a problem in the slightest. And we are able to get it into quite a nice low orbit. And you can see pretty much everything has been ticked off for this already. Now I just need to wait for a bit and we'll pass that. And there we go, it has been done. Achieve lunar orbit and transfer the data, and that gave me quite a fair whack of new confidence. But now, Shackleton IV has finally made its way over to Mars on the 10th of September 1963. And this is going to be our first attempt at orbiting Mars and also sending something down to the surface to land. And the whole premise of this episode, poor planning almost cost us Mars, well, it starts now. And that is, I didn't really take into account solar panel degradation on the travel over to Mars, and unfortunately, I don't really gain enough electric charge from these solar panels anymore to keep the probe alive unless I turn off nearly every single scientific experiment. It will gain electric charge briefly if I have some of them on, and it will last, but I'm not going to be getting anywhere near as much science as I could have done, but we will get enough electric charge to perform a successful capture burn. So it's not been a complete failure, and like I said, this is poor planning. I should have accounted for this when I designed this vessel, but I just did not. And going forwards, I really need to maybe think about designing my craft a little bit better. But it's not the only poor planning that I did for this vehicle, which I will talk about a little bit once we get to the lander. I tried planning this a lot, and I made sure that the lander could successfully land, and I did multiple tests, but there was a certain aspect of it that I overthought, which was a bit of a problem. But we have now burnt to lower our peri-G, not peri-G, I'm just going to say peri-apps because I don't know what it is for Mars. Peri-Arian, I think it might be, so that we are on a crash course with Mars because the lander needs to land, but this satellite is supposed to remain in orbit. So what we're going to do is we're going to decouple it from the lander section, which is now going spinning off, and we are going to use the RCS thrusters on this to put it back into a Martian orbit. We're at 141 by about 120 kilometers right now, so we're pretty much there. Mars atmosphere starts at 125 kilometers in real solar system. But we have got that back to orbit. What we're going to do now is attempt to land this on the surface of Mars. We decouple this from the transfer stage and the Mars capture stage, and now it is only a tiny little probe. This has no engines on it whatsoever. All it has is parachutes, an RTG, a few solar panels, and a few experiments. It's not very big at all. There's no propulsive landing, but I did check the parachutes multiple times, and it can land successfully on the surface. Now, the poor planning that I mentioned that has actually caused this aspect of the mission to be a failure is the communication, as is the thumbnail, disconnected. We've currently got a signal to the satellite and we are bouncing a signal back. However, it doesn't last, and as soon as we land, the satellite can't quite reach us. And I did test this in simulations, but unfortunately, whilst I was simulating this, my tracking station wasn't at the level that it was now. And because of that, I did get no communication to Mars whatsoever. Even if I had a ridiculously strong antenna on the satellite, it just wouldn't reach Mars. So I flew all of these simulations with no signal for control turned on, and I noticed that the actual parts of the missions that needed to happen, like landing on Mars, was successful. Like, look, we've just landed on the surface of Mars. But unfortunately, we've got no communication with the satellite that is in Mars orbit. And that is a real shame, and I kept coming back to the satellite hoping please connect. I turned on the path just to see, and we fly straight over, and it doesn't get a connection. Now, I planned in the vehicle assembly building for this. I planned for the satellite, and I knew that the satellite would have constant communication back to Earth because I made it powerful enough. However, what I didn't take into account was the satellite talking to the probe on the surface, and that's where it went wrong. But now, on the 20th of September, we are going to be launching Spark number 14. And this is going to be my final attempt at landing something on the moon, at least until we send crew over to the moon. Because there is an optional contract to land on the far side yet again, and I'm going to try and do that because it gets me more confidence, it gets me more reputation, that means my money will go up, and it also means that I can pick up contracts a little faster. One thing that went wrong there is I clearly messed up my staging, and unfortunately the Pegasus stage engine fired at the same time as the 4 RL-10 engines on the second stage of the Pinnacle. Not ideal, but I was pretty quick to kill that engine, and fortunately the RL-10 does have multiple ignitions, so I can light it up again once performing TLI. That has now been completed, and Spark 14 is on its way to the moon. A little laggy as we pass by Earth, unfortunately, due to the older versions of RSS Reborn, and we fire up the Juno 4K engine to capture us into a lunar orbit, which fires up, but unbeknownst to me at the time, because I didn't have the HUD up, unfortunately, we suffered a performance loss failure, and that meant that I used way more fuel than I would have needed to capture at the moon, which means I don't have enough to land. And because of that, well, I thought it's about time that we do finish the uncrewed lunar surface exploration program. So that's why I am back in the most exciting place of all of KSP, the administration building. Because I'm also thinking of picking up geostationary communication too. So there we go, we have completed the program. Didn't really have much time left on that, so I barely got any new reputation. And then we pick up the geostationary communication network program at only fast speed, because I do want to save the vast majority of my confidence for more lucrative programs later on. But now on the 20th of October, we are going to be attempting to send our first geostationary satellite to geostationary orbit. And geostationary is about the same amount of fuel that you need to go to the moon. So we are going to be using an Odyssey rocket for this, an Odyssey rocket that does have a Pegasus stage, or kind of a miniature Pegasus stage, because the Pegasus stage needs to be launched on top of a Pinnacle. This one is a lot smaller, but it does do the job well. And we have made our way up to orbit using the Odyssey, and now we are going to be plotting out our maneuver to get to geostationary orbit. When launching from Cape Canaveral in RSS, we are launching at an inclination of 28.6 degrees, which is obviously some ways off of the 0 degree inclination that we need to achieve geostationary orbit. In order to overcome this, I burn to get to geostationary orbit at the ascending node of the equator, and then that will put my orbit, that will put my apogee at around roughly the place that I need to be, where I will be at a 0 degree inclination to change my inclination once I'm at my apogee. That was a lot of words in quick succession, and I'm not even sure if they all made sense. But doing it this way, and you can see that I'm plotting it out now, means that the delta V that you require to change your inclination is the least it needs to be, because an inclination change like this is very costly. And as far as I'm aware, this is the best way to do it in RSS. Like, if you're launching in regular KSP, you're launching at pretty much a 0 degree inclination anyway. And yeah, this is something that, say, launching from Kourou is a lot better for, because that's only got an inclination of about 5 degrees once you launch from Kourou, which is going to be absolutely fantastic for me when I'm launching geostationary satellites in for all Kerbal kind. Unfortunately, this contract is one where we have to give back the satellite, but it does give me a fair amount of confidence and reputation, and this is something that I can repeat multiple times. But now, having done it once, I thought, let's set up a network, and in between that, I finally build the Gemini crewed vehicle and renovate the old garrison complex, because I didn't want to build a new launch complex for that. And now this is something very unusual in a Kerbal Gets Real Redux video. This is going to be me building the geostationary communications network. And I've not really been including build time lapses in this at all, because as you can see, the camera moves incredibly quickly. I think I've set this to 8 times speed, because otherwise it just takes forever, and it's a little bit weird. If you want to skip this section, I have chaptered the video, so you can go ahead. But I thought I might as well include a build section and ask you, the viewer, do you like this? Do you want me to keep these in so you can see exactly the sort of satellites that I am building over the course of this series? Or would you rather just see the launches and the Space Center sections? I'm going to leave that up to you. Let me know in the comments, because I want to know, because if I put these in, it tends to make the videos a little bit longer, and you get a little bit more content, and it means that I have to struggle thinking about exactly what I'm going to talk about whilst I am building one of these. But what I am doing is making one for the moment, and I'm using a website called Maya Web. I'll put a link to that in the description to tell me exactly how much delta V that I'm going to need to put this satellite into geostationary orbit once I have set up a resonant orbit. And I'll talk a little bit more about resonant orbits when we get to the actual launch of this mission. It's a very, very handy website, and it means that I have gone into this with a bit of forethought and I can plan this mission a little bit better. But we have designed the entire satellite, and it does fulfill the contract requirements. Now what I have done is place a payload fairing and copied this 4 times, because I am going to be setting up a network that contains 4 satellites, and hopefully, if I do this correctly, then they will all be equidistant from each other. That means we should have constant communication around Earth, which is going to be fabulous. Right now I'm just finishing the final little touches, adding a little bit of detailing to make it look like the satellites aren't floating in the middle of the air and that they are actually attached to something, before finally placing it on a Pinnacle rocket, tooling it all up, and building it, getting ready to launch it on the 24th of December, right at the end of 1963. We only picked up this program a couple of months ago, and this is actually the final part of the program. As soon as I finish this contract, if it all goes well here, then I will have successfully finished the program in about 2 months, and it's a program that's supposed to last 2 years if you pick it up at fast or even breakneck speed. If you pick it up at breakneck speed, I'm fairly sure you just get a bigger payout in the first year. That's the only difference. It's still a 2-year-long program. When firing up the second stage of the Pinnacle, unfortunately, one of the RL-10 engines did suffer a performance loss failure yet again. So I decided to actually shut down that engine to prevent me losing a lot of delta V. And this means that I have got nowhere near as much thrust as I would have done. So you can see the rocket did perform a little bit of a course correction change there to try and get it into the orbit that I originally put into MechJeb ascent guidance. Now, we needed an Odyssey to get a single satellite to geostationary orbit. The Pinnacle can get 4 to geostationary orbit, but it is overbuilt for that, which means this failure, although pretty bad, is not mission ending. But now that we're in orbit, I have plotted out a maneuver to get me to about 49 million meters, rather than the 37-ish million meters that you need to be for geostationary. This is because I'm going to be setting this up into a resonant orbit, as I mentioned earlier on, and 49 million meters is where it needs to be in order for the satellites that I release one by one to burn and then finally be all equidistant from each other. And I've gone for the higher orbit first because, once again, this comes to making the inclination change. If I make the inclination change at a higher point in my orbit, it'll be a lot cheaper to perform, and this is how I tested it in simulations, and it worked. And I was going to follow my flight plan to the letter to hopefully avoid any more things going wrong, because at the moment things really have been going wrong. Out of the 7 launches of this episode, I'm fairly sure 5 of them had problems with test flight, and this is something that I've experienced a lot over this save. Test flight seems to really be biting me where it hurts. I'm sure it will improve in the next episode, right? Seriously, 1964 is going to be so painful. But we have plotted out our maneuver to get us into a geostationary orbit, and what I have done is raised my perigee so that it is at geostationary height. And then what I do is I circularize each satellite at perigee. So I get my orbit nice and circular once I reach perigee, and then I skip an orbit and then I do it with the next satellite. And once I've done that 4 times, every single satellite will be equidistant from each other, and it will make a very nice square around Earth. And this is perfect because that means that I will have constant communication when I am at Earth, because these satellites are providing communication. We can bounce a signal back off of them each and every single time. Right now I'm plotting out the maneuver for the first of these satellites to try and get into a geostationary orbit, and I have more than enough delta V because I use Maya Web, once again link in the description, to plan this out for me. Unfortunately, because I am using Principia, it does mean that these satellites are going to shift ever so slightly, even though I get them near enough perfectly in a geostationary orbit. And I have mentioned before, I am in 1967 right now, and the network is still reasonable, but yeah, the satellites have moved over slightly. But you can see, as I mentioned, we have created a lovely square around Earth, and we just need to wait 2 days for the contract to finish, which it does on the 31st of December, at the very end of the year. And that means I can actually finish the program, but I'm not going to do that yet because I'm still getting quite a bit of payout from it, and I want to launch several more of those optional geostationary contracts. But once again, we find ourselves on the 1st of January, this time 1964, and over this year, expect failures. But not just that, Gemini, Rendezvous, I'm not going to play the song, spacewalks, additional Mars and Venus missions, and much more. A big thanks to KC, CDR San, Opus, Redstone Wizard, Shadow Dev, Y Mandarin, Chris Morrison, Darth Malachor, Mr. Blue Star, Rail Cowgirl, Ryan Miller, and the rest of my patrons and members for their continued support. I have been Karnasa, and I will see you later.